Hello everyone, my name is Zach and welcome to On Cash Flow, where I help you become a master of your own cash flow. Now let's get started. Yes, you can increase your wealth even after you retire. You can still grow your net worth even if you are retired and you're withdrawing from your investments. It's actually quite simple in theory. All you really need to do is make sure that your return on your investments is going to be higher than the amount of inflation plus the amount of withdrawals that you take from your investments. So if you have, let's say, an 8% average return on your investment per year over a long period, and you have an average inflation rate of 3%, and then you also have an initial withdrawal rate of 4% per year, then theoretically, your investments should grow by an average of 1% per year. So you take the 8% ROI, you subtract out your inflation rate of 3%, and then you subtract out your spending rate of 4%, and that should be, 1% left over. That's 8 minus 3 minus 4, and you have 1 left over, and that should theoretically be your portfolio investment growth. Now, is it going to work out this way, perfectly like this in the real world? Probably not, most likely not. As we can look back at historical data, we can see that it's not going to be a perfect 8% ROI. It's not going to be a perfect 3% inflation every single year. So these are meant to be just over the long-term kind of averages here. So this is what we're representing here. Your investment returns need to be higher than the amount of inflation plus the amount of withdrawals that you take from your portfolio, and theoretically your net worth should still grow even while you're retired. Now, how are we going to make this formula work? Well, it's actually very simple because it's a very simple formula. Basically, what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to tweak some of the variables that are in this formula. So the ways that we can do this is, first off, we can increase the amount of ROI we have. We can increase our investment returns. That's going to make it more likely that we're going to be able to still grow our wealth while we are already retired. Number two, we're going to have to decrease or keep it less our inflation rate of how much we're going to increase the amount of spending we do by the amount of our personal inflation rate. Then number three, we can start with an initial lower withdrawal rate from our investment portfolio. So those are the three variables that we can tweak. And the first part of that formula is to increase our investment returns. Now, here is one way that we could possibly increase our investment returns. We could change the asset allocation within our portfolios. So generally speaking, the more aggressive of a portfolio that you have, the more likely it is to return higher returns than a more conservative portfolio. So for this example, I have 3 different portfolios for you. In order to possibly increase our investment returns, we can try to have a more aggressive portfolio, which in this case, we're going to have more stocks versus bonds. So here are 3 examples I have for you. A very aggressive portfolio, a medium aggressiveness portfolio, and the least aggressive portfolio. And for these 3 hypothetical portfolios, I'm going to be using 3 different asset classes. So we have a total US stock market index fund, we have a total international stock market index fund, and we have a total US bond index fund. So the first portfolio, which is the most aggressive, is going to be 100% stocks. And that's going to be 80% US stock and 20% international stock. The medium portfolio is going to have 60% US stock and 20% international stock. And then it's going to have 20% bonds. So that's technically going to be 80% stocks and 20% bonds. And then we have the least aggressive portfolio example here, and that is going to be 40% US stocks, 20% international stocks, and 40% US bonds. So we have 60% stocks and 40% bonds in the least aggressive portfolio. And as you can see on the screen, from the years of 1972 to 2021, which is about 49 years, we can see that the most aggressive portfolio grew to $29 million. The medium aggressive portfolio grew to $19 million, and the least aggressive portfolio grew to $16 million. The big takeaway here is that historically speaking, a more aggressive portfolio, one that is invested more in stocks versus bonds, is most likely going to return a higher amount over the long run than would a more moderate portfolio consisting of more bonds would. No scientific breakthroughs here, right? But yes, more risk generally means more reward when it comes to sound investing, as long as you're not taking completely unnecessary risk. But there are also other things that you have to keep in mind, because with more risk means more standard deviation. Those portfolios with more stocks and less bonds are going to have a much higher standard deviation, which means their prices are going to fluctuate a lot more than the portfolios with more bonds. And that is generally what we refer to when we're talking about risk. We kind of associate that with the standard deviation. When there is temporary market depressions or temporary market recessions, the portfolios that are going to have more stocks are going to have way worse years than the portfolios that have bonds in them to kind of smooth the ride a little bit more. That is a trade-off that you're going to have to make if you want to increase your net worth while you are in retirement. You're going to have to take on more risk, you're going to have to take on more standard deviation, and then you're probably going to have a lot worse years when there are market recessions and things like that. However, on a side note here, changing your asset allocation, while that is probably one of the main ways that you can increase your ROI, there are a few other ways that you can technically increase your ROI. So one might be if you have your investments in like actively managed mutual funds, or if you have your investments in funds that charge a higher amount of fees, just by switching to very low cost index funds, you could technically increase your ROI a lot by reducing the amount of fees that you pay, because those small amounts of fees do actually cut into the amount of ROI that you really receive over the long run. By reducing your investment expenses, you can definitely increase your ROI that way. And another way would be tax optimization. So technically, if you're paying taxes on your ROI, on the amount of investment returns that you get, every single year, maybe as you're selling investments because you're living off of it in retirement, if you're able to optimize your taxes, then technically you could say that you're increasing your ROI because you're not giving up as much of your ROI that's going towards taxes. But probably my favorite way of increasing your ROI is liking this video. If you're liking this video so far, please make sure you like it and give it a thumbs up. It really does help me out, and I really do appreciate that. I promise you it will help increase your ROI if you like this video, because that means that you'll be able to watch more of my videos and you will gain a lot of good insight and, stuff in your brain. Okay, but like the video, please, if you like it. It really does help me out, and I really do appreciate that. But now we can move on to point number 2, and that is inflation. So if you're able to decrease inflation, then that means that you can probably be more likely to grow your net worth while you are already retired. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, like, what the heck? I can't decrease inflation. I have no control over inflation. And yes, you would be 100% correct. So technically, what we define as inflation, I think is published by BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So I think they're the ones who are responsible for publishing that. But anyway, they published the CPI, which is the Consumer Price Index. So whatever number they publish on there is generally thought to and referred to as the inflation rate. So when I'm talking about reducing inflation, I'm not talking about reducing the CPI that's published by the BLS. No, I'm talking about reducing your personal inflation rate. The amount that's published by the BLS, that is going to be kind of like an average, like a combination of all these different kinds of things that increase in price. You personally, you're probably not going to have the same inflation rate as the CPI. And that's because the CPI is based on a standard average American worker probably living in a city, and they have these certain kinds of expenses that they spend money on. But you as an early retiree, you as a person who is financially independent, your expenses are not going to be affected the same as someone who is the typical American, because the typical American spends 100% of their take-home pay, and they spend money on stuff that they probably don't need to be spending money on. So really the point here is that your personal inflation rate, you probably have a little bit more control over that than you would originally think. And so if you're able to keep your personal inflation rate down, then you could theoretically increase your net worth in retirement, because you're reducing one of those negative factors within that formula that we talked about in the beginning. And just to give you a little bit of more concrete of an example here, recently the CPI rose from 6.8% in November of 2020 to November of 2021. So they say that the CPI rose by 6.8%. That doesn't mean that your personal expenses or my personal expenses rose by 6.8%. In fact, it could be higher or lower depending on what factors of that CPI increased the most. Just going off the top of my head here, gas and natural oil and things like that actually increased a lot more than 6.8%. So if you have a house, let's say, that needs to be heated by one of those commodities in the winter, then your bills might have gone up more than 6.8%. Me, however, my house is technically all electric and it doesn't require gas at all. My bills do not go up by 30% or whatever it was for natural gas. And so overall, the takeaway here when it comes to inflation is that I think that you can control your personal inflation rate a lot more than someone who is the typical standard American consumer. And then speaking of things that are under or within your control, that is variable number 3, and that is your withdrawal rate. So if you start with an initial withdrawal rate that is less than 4%, and trust me, you can actually do that. There's no rule that says you have to do 4%. You can start with less of it. Then that means that theoretically, that should give you a higher chance of increasing your net worth in retirement. So let's say you could start with 3.5%, or you could start with even 3% instead of 4%. Let's say you had a FIRE number of $1 million. We know that for easy math, we multiply it by 4%, that's gonna be $40,000. If we multiply it by 3.5%, that's $35,000 per year. If we multiply it by 3%, that's $30,000 per year. How you can make this happen is either A, reduce your expenses down to the amount that you would need for a lower initial withdrawal rate, and or B, increase the amount of investments that you have. Increase your FIRE number so that you have a larger number to base your percentage of withdrawals off of. If you have $1.2 million, 3% of that is going to be more than 3% of $1 million, obviously. So that is how you can kind of manipulate and start with an initial lower withdrawal rate. This is also going to give you that higher likelihood of increasing your net worth in retirement. And as a quick concrete example here, if you're wanting to spend $40,000 per year while you're in early retirement, then you would take $1 million, multiply it by 4%. That's using the 4% rule. So you would have $40,000. But if you wanted to use, let's say, 3.5%, you would take about $1.15 million, multiply that by 3.5%, and that should give you about $40,000 as well. So the 1.15 million at 3.5% is how you would theoretically reduce the amount of your initial withdrawal rate by 0.5% as compared to the standard 4% safe withdrawal rule. This is how I think that you could get richer even after you become retired, even after you become financially independent. However, that's not the only thing that you need to worry about once you become financially independent. There are some other things that you need to keep in mind. And that's why if you have not already, I have another video for you that you need to watch. It's my full guide on what to do after you achieve financial independence. So this is very important to know. Even if you're not at financial independence yet, you should know about this guide. So please make sure that you watch this next video that I have for you. It's going to pop up right next to me. Thank you so much for watching this video. I'm Zach from OnCashflow.com, and I hope to see you next time.